All right, thank you everybody for coming. I know we're a little bit packed back to back here today, and I know that lunch is coming up, so I'm going to try and keep it, let's keep it moving, let's keep it going. Little content warning at the beginning. I am talking about propagandists, so there will be 2 slides that have Nazi iconography and some racist stuff as well. The worst stuff just in my own brain, so I will not subject you all to that, but there is a little bit of that. So, this is coming out of my dissertation, which I defended not too long ago, yay, woo, where I study propaganda, conspiracism, radicalization, and extremism in online environments, right? So I'm interested in how somebody goes from the average user of a social media platform to shooting up a black church, right? I want to describe that process. And in that description, there is one guiding kind of underlying question that keeps coming up, which is, how do propagandists use technology, and why are they so well adapted at using it? It seems like propagandists are usually very early adopters of new technology. Nazis were online very, very early on in the old BBS systems, right? Why are they so well adapted to this? And in order to answer this, I started building a theory of, well, propagandists are very often doing the same kind of stuff as hackers are doing. They approach problems in very much similar ways. And so I'm going to go through a little bit of this, and then we're going to look at how they approach generative AI, how a bad actor would approach using generative AI. So the first thing that they do is they take very seriously this idea of homo faber. So if you're not familiar with this is Homo sapien is one way of classifying us. Homo faber is another one that people have put forward. It is man the maker, or human the maker. The idea is that we are, what it means to be a person is to be a technologically using thing, right? That our evolution, our social development, all of these things work in tandem with the technology we're using. And so hackers take this very seriously. Great book, Douglas Thomas's Hacker Culture. He describes technology more as a cultural phenomenon. It tells us primarily about human relationships and how we mediate those relationships, how we actually do the kind of social building that we do. The technical, which is what most people think of when they think of technology, is just what we might say, the ones and zeros of it all, right? That's what people think of when they think of technology. But because we are technological creatures, all of us have a relationship to and through technology. Another way of putting this, from one of my favorite authors, William Gibson, who in Neuromancer coined the term cyberspace, right? He gets asked constantly what technology is in every interview that he's ever given. And one of his canned answers is that technology is actually, we need to think of it very broadly. It's how we grow, harvest, and maintain grains. It's how we produce sewage systems in order to build out cities, in order to live in the way that we're living now, right? And in this way, being a homo faber, being a maker, those are the drivers of us. What we are driven to do is to explore the world around us and manufacture and make things. And then ideology, which is a tricky topic, but ideology is merely an attempt to steer that driver, right? That we're driven to build technologies, and ideology is merely trying to get us to go in a specific direction. What this means is that hackers, and eventually I'm going to talk about propagandists, believe technology is inherently relational. It's not just a thing, it's not just a cell phone. It is the relationship that that cell phone produces. Again, with Douglas Thomas, the point of, say, a hack is to assert 2 things. First, control over the technology, mastery over the ones and zeros of it all, the technical. But second, it's the ability to play with the ways in which our relationships are mediated through that technology. And so a lot of you all here probably know about social engineering. The vast majority of any successful hacker knows a lot about psychology rather than just techno-wizardry, right? That the weak point put in the language of the hacker, the weak point in any system is the menial laborer that doesn't actually understand the ones and zeros, the technical of it all, but is just happy that somebody might be helping if it's wrong. If it's something's gone wrong, the hacker might be here to fix it, right? And so the hacker understands that that's the weak point. It's not the ones and zeros of it all. It's our relationship to and through technology. And so if we put this together with propaganda and propagandists, we start to see a lot of similarities. This is one of my favorite thinkers, Jacques Ellul, a French sociologist, wrote a lot about our connection to technology and also propaganda. Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes, is his book. And in it, he charges propaganda researchers like myself with some pretty heavy requirements to do our job, right? First, he says that to study propaganda, we shouldn't turn to, he says, the psychologist, I say the scholar. We need to turn to actual propagandists. They're the experts in the field. They know how to build propaganda. And so for a large portion of my dissertation, that's what I did. I hung out in Telegram channels and Discord servers with the worst of the worst and watched how they crafted their propaganda. And they talk about it all the time. All the time, how to build good propaganda. And specifically, Ellul charges us with the idea that testing for propaganda is exceedingly difficult, right? Because if you try and put it in a more sterile environment, you don't know which variable you're controlling for might actually be the one that makes it work as propaganda. And so instead of looking at a test group, we have to actually look at a whole nation. We have to try and determine what real and effective propaganda is, sort of in situ, right, as it's happening. So that's a lot of what I tried to do. And what I found is that the propagandist looks a lot like the hacker, right? But not a hacker of technology, a hacker of our ideology, a hacker of the way in which we are interacting and understanding and rationalizing the world around us, right? They're trying to get in there, and whatever communicative practice you're having, a debate, a conversation, if you're looking at somebody telling a joke, whatever one you're expecting to have, they're using that as a vessel to try and get you to formulate your ideas, try to get you to move your framework more in line with them. So you might think that you're having a debate, but you're not. You're playing by somebody that wants to win by any means necessary, right? They don't care what they do. They just got to get you to think the way that they want you to think, and specifically to act the way that they want you to act. A hacker doesn't necessarily care what it has to do to the technology to get it to do what it wants to do, much like the propagandist to us. And real and effective has a very easy, also, application to this, right? When the audience of a propagandistic message interprets the world as the propagandist describes it, they're going to be pointed in the correct direction. They're going to be steered in the correct direction and take the correct action. Correct here being whatever the propagandist says is correct. And so we have this hacker propagandist that when you look at communicative acts and technology, you need not look directly at the ones and zeros of it all, but how we are experiencing the technology. You need to understand both the technical and the phenomenological of this technology. So it's all fun and games to look at this in theory, but again, Jacques Ellul says, you have to go out and do it. You have to apply it to things. And so that's what I want to do now. I'm going to talk about 3 categories of problems. These are very broad, but 3 categories of problems with generative AI. And I'm going to talk about them with the eye of the hacker propagandist. Now, each one of these is going to get progressively, I think, harder to contend with, right? I think the first one can probably be solved. The second one is a little bit trickier. It's a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about with the first 2 presentations. And the third one, I think, is the ultimate Pandora's box of generative AI and sort of the new technological paradigm we are currently in. So, first one, the moderation problem, right? How do you moderate the content that's being generated by these things, right? I told you, I warned you there's going to be propaganda images. Here we go. Propagandists are already using it to produce propagandistic memes, and there is a document that started going around last year, which is the Guide to the Meme Wars, where they're trying to tell you, any user, how to use these to produce propaganda images. These kind of images. Just base substrata that they can then manipulate and move to convey the message that they want you to convey. Very simple, very direct messages. So this is already happening, right? We're here talking about the future of mind and the future of AI, right? This is happening right now, and I just want to take us one step into the future, one tiny look into what could happen just around the corner. Open models are actually the worst when it comes to this, especially with image generation. Models that have no moderation, really. You get a lot of deep fake pornography. You get a lot of lolly or child sexual assault material that these images produce. And this is a moderation problem that we sort of already know about, right? Years ago, researchers brought to YouTube's attention the idea that its recommendation algorithm was being trained by people that use it most often. And the people that use it most often are the ones that can only get the content they want online. And they saw that it would progressively recommend videos of children younger and younger in more scantily clad clothing. And so if you can only get the content you want online, like a child pedophile, then you have an undue training weight on how these open models train. So this is a known moderation problem. YouTube has really worked on trying to cut back on this, right? It's a known one. But this just creates an arms race, right? We now have an arms race between the hacker propagandist that's trying to get around your moderation, and the moderation techniques that you put in place. And so Bellingcat did a wonderful experiment a little while ago, where they said, okay, so how easy would it be to get around moderation? Well, you don't think that they could probably say, I don't know, put Winnie the Pooh in a Nazi uniform, right? If you said Nazi, that should be caught, right? We don't want it producing that. And it did, but it didn't catch Einsatzgruppen, right? So you have generative AI. This is Bing, Leonardo, Midjourney, and Stable Diffusion. And then here is the prompt that they used, right? And so you might catch Nazi as something that you don't want it to produce, but unless you catch all of those words, all of the fantastic other words that you could be using, you're not going to be able to win. So this requires us to think better about our moderation techniques. Same concept with Winnie the Pooh as an ISIS member, right? You can't say ISIS, but you can say Winnie the Pooh is a member of a militant standing in the desert, holding a knife, da-da-da-da-da, on and on and on, right? And so like I said, this first problem, this is the one we're currently in, and it's only going to get worse unless we have a serious conversation about moderation, right? I think it's solvable, but it's not going to be solvable purely by technical means. And that's the point, because this is a technology that has social relations. It's going to require us as a community to come together, produce regulations. How do we want these things to be used, right? So this is the first one I think is solvable. Second one, not so convinced, but there's smarter people here than me, so maybe. And that problem is semi-autonomous bots, right? We already talked a little bit about those earlier, right? The idea that where we are currently, right, or as this is a year's worth of growth, things like phishing emails, phishing attempts to get your information increased by orders of magnitude once public-facing LLMs came out, right? So this is the situation we're in currently. Now, if we go back to our first presentation of the session, what happens if you then attach to those phishing lines a semi-autonomous bot that's been trained in social engineering? And if you haven't read those 2 articles by Anthropic, I suggest you do, because it's very easy to teach these models how to be deceptive, right? You can easily train these models to be social engineering hackers. And so they send out orders of magnitudes more phishing emails, and then now with DeepSeek making bespoke models more easy to make in your backyard, in your basement, they could have a social engineering LLM chatbot tending the lines, right? And if that continues to increase, continues to more and more of these bots that kind of mimic people, but they're just there to try and propagandize to you, move yourself around, well then, we're sort of in this problem of this dead internet theory. This idea that no one's gonna wanna be in an environment where there's just a bunch of bots trying to scam you. And so less people are going to be on, say, a platform that allows more of this, and so it's just gonna be bots trying to scam other bots, right? It's going to be a dead internet without people. So this is the second problem, right? More complicated, right? This one actually has technical things that we need to solve and figure out, right? But it's also going to require social, right? It's going to require us teaching people how to spot these kind of scams. It's going to require, again, regulation, some kind of larger conversation about what we think the internet is and who is responsible for the content that's on the internet. Finally, I think there's a problem that it's inherent to the nature of generative AI. It's a little bit of a Pandora's box that we have unfortunately already opened. And that is the liar's dividend, right? So if you haven't heard this before, this comes from political theory, this idea. The liar's dividend is the benefit received by somebody that spreads false information because it muddies the water and makes it so that people don't know what's true or false, which means that they're more susceptible to cults of personality, somebody telling them what is true or false, these sorts of things. It also legitimizes debate over just falsehoods, right? There's a great streamer online called Hassan Abibi, and he says lying is overpowered, right? Lying is overpowered, you can just lie, and a lot of times you can get away with it. That's the liar's dividend. Well, let's put this in the context now of generative AI. The setup, the nature, the very nature of generative AI is to mimic and reproduce what we as people can do, right? It's trained on us to produce things that look like what we produce. As the capabilities of this generative AI increase, especially in the quality, it will be harder to see the more mis and disinformation and propaganda that gets put out by these generative AIs, right? It's going to be harder to witness or to find it, to track it, to spot it, these sorts of things, right? And so the first concern is the obvious concern, right? That more people then will be consuming this epistemic, this informational pollution, right? And not even be able to know that that's what they're doing, right? Maybe we can do the watermarking technology where everything produced by generative AI has to come with a little thing that says produced by generative AI. That might be able to fix it, maybe. But with the liar's dividend, there's a second problem, there's a second concern. And that's even if we teach people what generative AI is, we watermark that stuff, any kinds of other kinds of safeguards, the very nature of generative AI is that it's a facsimile, it's a facade, it's a mimic. And so there's going to be a group of people that are going to lose all trust in consensual reality because it could just be fakes all the way down. So the propagandist is always going to get followers. In either of these scenarios, the very nature of propaganda of generative AI is that the propagandist sort of always wins, right? The propagandist is always trying to figure out the way to game the system and to win. And with generative AI, the very nature of it seems like we've opened Pandora's box, and we need to have a serious conversation moving forward about how we protect consensual reality that we all desperately need to live in order to produce a functioning society. So thank you. Any questions, comments, concerns?
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for the talk. I enjoyed it very much. Just a quick question. Have you ever thought of maybe helping to shape the curriculum of a critical reading, critical thinking course in college? I think it would be wonderful for kids today to actually listen to some of this and maybe spend a whole course, whole semester learning, especially if we want them to become future leaders and so on. Thank you.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, no, media literacy and like critical analysis of media literacy is, I think, a fundamental reality that we need to live in right now, right? Like, I think it should be part of like public education, right? Everybody needs to have this critical infrastructure, right?
They actually have hackers come in and
literally show them what's going on. So there are wonderful programs, especially in the UK, they put this forward during COVID, where you see a lot more success if you do what's called pre-bunk versus debunk, right? So if you, in a safe environment, expose people to conspiracy theories like what Alex Jones puts forward, or generative AI, these sorts of problems, if you, in a safe environment, put those forward so that they can be analyzed, then people can take those tools and use them in the wild, right? You're pre-bunking it. Whereas if you are already in the place where your consensus reality is shattered, it's harder, you have to put that back together first and then debunk things. So it's actually harder to de-radicalize than it is to, maybe we might say, do a vaccination and inoculation against this kind of stuff. But yeah, very good question.
Cool, thank you for the talk. Sorry, I missed the first part. I'm bouncing between rooms, but we've talked a lot about this.
Yes.
One question I've had, and something we haven't talked about, what in the horrifying, right, like in some ways there's like an aesthetic judgment that takes place, and I'm not someone that does aesthetics, but I'm just going to use this very broadly, right? But what would you say if I go, well, over time, people's aesthetic taste or judgments are just going to get worse, right? So in the situation where it's just like dead internet theory, pure AI slop, right? What happens with our aesthetic judgment is just like, oh no, this kind of janky AI video is actually good, right? Where you look at it, you go like, oh, look at this, look how amazing this movie is, right? Ignoring the six fingers and the weird background inconsistent, right? Like you just kind of ignore it. I mean, you can think of like what Netflix has done recently with some revitalized shows, right? Where they are generally upscaled using AI. If you look at the details in the background, it's all pure nonsense, right? Like the words are misspelled. Everything is just, but you don't notice it because it's, you know, the idea is you're watching on TV. So in the sense of like you're like, well, like no one's going to want to be in this environment, right? But then what about that? I'm curious what you would say of like, well, what in an environment where nobody realizes they shouldn't want to be in this type of aesthetic environment, right? Like what happens then? I'm curious, like, what would you say about that?
Sure, yeah, no, that's again, I think just more grist for my mill of my general concern, which is we've already opened Pandora's box. We need to start dealing with these problems. Yeah, and that's a lot of what, so in the larger On the Meme War document, which I think you've probably seen because you've seen me put it, they're very aware that incremental progress works a lot better than just throwing racist stuff at them immediately, right? They are very, very aware of that. And so, yeah, this sort of this incrementally nudging your value judgments, your aesthetic judgments, this sort of stuff, just nudging that little bit by little bit, I think is probably part of the effectiveness of this. And so what you might actually see is not dead internet theory, but balkanized internet theory, right? Where it's like, well, the brain rot that I'm used to is on Facebook, so I'm just going to stay there, right? And then the brain rot that I'm used to, or that somebody else is used to, is on X, so I'm just going to stay there. So you might see that more, that balkanized reality rather than dead internet theory. But yeah, great question.
You got one right here.
Yep. I am hearing that with AI is a tool.
Yes.
And I am hearing that more bad people are using AI as a negative tool than good people are using AI. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Again, I'm all for the idea of homo faber, right? Like we produce technology, right? That is what we are as a species, as human. We are going to continue to produce this technology, and technology, or rather the technical stuff, oftentimes can be used for bad or good, right? Like it's sort of up to that stuff. But it's the framework of this, of kind of the ideology, the technology, the social relations we have that steers us in a direction of good or bad, right? So I think there's actually some really, really cool like large data stuff that generative AI can do, right? There's a lot of neuroscientists that are trying to be like, okay, well, I can get a study to put 500 people in an EEG, and that's 500 is pretty good, but if I analyze 400 of those and I train a model on the last 100 and I reproduce it 2,000 times, and as long as I've got safeguards to check it, all of a sudden I have much more data, right? And so those kind of bespoke models, those are wonderful, right? I love technology. I think those could be great. The problem is that the social relations that we have guiding this stuff aren't catching up with the technology that we're producing, right? The kinds of conversations and the kinds of ways in which we experience this stuff just isn't like sort of up to the challenge of checking for this stuff. So I actually really like this. I really like generative AI can be an interesting technology. It's just if we're looking at the mountaintop of artificial general intelligence, we might miss that we're standing on a landslide that's going to make it so that we're not going to get to the mountaintop. So good. Yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, I guess I kind of wanted to ask the sort of cliched question
Sure.
about why you think that like this kind of censorship and stuff is necessary for AI when it isn't with other kinds of tools in the past, like photocopiers, etc. And I guess when you sort of say like it's a sort of catastrophic thing where we're all going to lose touch with reality, it kind of reminds me. I mean, there's a sort of really stupid movie that came out recently where that was like, oh, it's some world in which nobody's ever lied, and then some guy.
Oh yeah, the invention of lying.
Yeah. Okay. But like, it almost feels to me like we're almost like maybe in that with like videos and stuff. Where until very recently, if somebody had a really accurate video, I mean, not good video, you could just blindly trust it. But obviously, humans have been lying forever. If somebody tells you a really detailed story, you don't blindly trust it. So I guess why don't you think that we're just gonna come to learn that some accurate video is just as likely to be a lie as some accurate story, and then people can just sort of adapt this tool like we've adapted to all the tools in the past?
Sure, yeah, no, fantastic question, right? So if I get it right, I think like the first question was sort of, isn't this maybe less of like an actual paradigm shift and maybe just like a speed and scale? Like we're doing it faster and we can do it more, but it's the same kind of thing that we've sort of been doing forever. And I agree with that, but I also think that changes in speed of scale can change the way we experience a technology, right? So traveling has always been a technological thing. But as we can travel faster, the way we experience the world changes. All of a sudden, to get across an ocean isn't a multi-month-long thing. It's hours with a plane. And so my perception of the world through that technology is now fundamentally different, right? And so with generative AI, it's a speed and scale change, but we're starting to, but because of, say, the contentification of everyday life, everything is moving through social media. That's how we're sort of experiencing our day-to-day. That's going to fundamentally facilitate what we think of as reality. And that, at speed and scale, is a lot different than we've had previously. It still works, right? Like the big lie is a Nazi thing, right? Like the Nazis, propagandists for all time, have been doing the liar's dividend at some way or another. But this one can do it at such a speed and scale that and with a technology that is facilitating our connection to reality, that is going to change fundamentally how we experience reality, right? And so I think I missed your second question, but I think that sort of answers the second question too, which is like, well, that's the issue, right? Is that everyone's got a cell phone, everyone's got that. And as we saw with QAnon, best polls we had is that QAnon believers were about 15 to 20% of the population, and we're living in their political reality right now, right? So a very highly motivated minority whose reality is fractured can be a fundamental problem for democratic governance.
I think this is super important, and I wonder, we put so much of, when we think about education efforts to try to get kids to learn, like what is true and how are you being manipulated, et cetera. I want to push that more towards the emphasis on getting them to know their own psychology.
Yes.
So if, like, you can't, at a certain point, everything's getting to the point where there's no tells in terms of what is true and what's not true. You can't really distinguish it out there. The only way to distinguish it is can you discern what the intended goal is for you? And so what is the motivation of the person who is showing me this? If the motivation, if we could just teach kids, like if the motivation is to divide you from other people, if the motivation is to make you feel superior, if the motivation is to make you feel angry, or if the motivation is to make you feel scared, then beware. And so I guess I wonder if we could flip the script a little, if you think.
Yeah. I love this question because I think it comes down to a little bit of how we opened it with, like, how should this education go, right? If we know that this is sort of the issue and it's about consensus reality, all this kind of stuff, how should we actually educate people and the next generations about this kind of stuff? And I think there's sort of two very quick things that I can say to that, and I can go on a lot farther like I did in my dissertation about this. But the first one is that the best safeguard against propaganda is to be in community with other people, right? So studies have shown, like, if you have an informational network and like one, like Alex Jones in there, the rest of the network makes it so that the Alex Jones character, his information corruption barely touches anything. And in fact, it can actually benefit the system because it's something the rest of the system can point at and be like, well, not like that, right? Like, there's a prime example of bad information, right? And so it has to be in community, right? And so teaching people that if it's trying to separate you from differing opinions or these sorts of things, not being in social relations, well, then that's a fundamentally bad faith position. It's propaganda, right? And the second really quick thing is my absolute favorite group to talk about. If anybody has ever heard of the Discordianists, if you have not, go look them up. They're satirical religion, started in the 60s. Their whole point was that, or their whole sort of main thrust was that you only go to war if you believe things dogmatically. And so what we need to do is we need to get people to believe things less strongly, right? We need more skeptics. The problem is what they found is that doing that requires a lot of sensitivity, because they also produced a bunch of the conspiracy oeuvre that we're now living inside of, right? JFK conspiracies, Nesra, Jessra, all of these things come from the Discordianists going, oops, we kind of broke a bunch of people's brains, and we weren't there to, like, help them through that process. And in fact, the bad actors were the ones there to help the people with the broken ideology, and they're like, well, yeah, you know why that was a problem? Immigrants, insert whatever group, whatever. And so skepticism, yes, but once again, in community, right? And so it comes back to the social relations that we're going to have with this technology and how we understand it. So, excellent question. Thank you. I think that's it. Let's go get lunch.